there are things that can just pull you along, that can, let's say, possess you, which means that there are some forces in the psyche that act autonomously and not necessarily in your interest. That this is really where he sees culture as a protection for human beings against these unconscious forces that can overwhelm them and basically rip apart their consciousness and then their ability to interact with the outside
That's
world.
the crazy thing. We have Christmas trees in
Oh,
Ecuador.
really?
I mean, Ecuador is Catholic. It's super
But,
Catholic.
what kind of tree?
Plastic trees. Welcome to the Telar Maestro podcast. I'm Emmanuel Ayala.
And I'm Marcus.
Yeah. Marcos, welcome to the podcast. This is an interesting story. I met Marcos here in Berlin because he organized a group about Jung, um, and I'm interested in knowing what was your motivation to start this Jung group.
Oh. Yeah, that's a very good question. So my motivation was mainly uh, I was interested in psychology in general, but never had the feeling that I would be able to really understand it. So what I would mostly read was popular culture and then like secondary sources that would explain things a little bit more easily. At least that was my impression. And because I don't have any psychology background, I did it all in my free time and then in my spare time. I was a little bit, let's say, afraid of primary sources, reading the original text, thinking, okay, it could be a little bit too hard for me to grasp, to understand. So, but at a certain point, I said, okay, I'm just going to try it. I'm just going to dive right into it. And Jung was someone that I always found very interesting, mainly because he has written this red book where he really dived into his psyche and recorded all the things that he experienced. And that appealed to me, like on a deep level. And I bought it and tried to read it, and I didn't understand it at all. So it disappeared again for a very long time. And it was then around the time when Jordan Peterson came up, and he really talked a lot about Jung, and he uses a lot of Jungian concepts. And I listened to him a lot for some time. And then I thought, okay, now I really want to know what's going on there. I want to have like direct knowledge because, let's say, in the internet, you have a lot of recycling of content. And then, of course, you have a lot of people inserting their own opinions and their own ideas into certain concepts. So I said to myself, I want to read everything from Jung, which is really a lot. And I wanted to do it by reading 20 pages a day. And this I did for over 2 years and read through the collected works, through the seminars, a lot of letters, and just different books that are published. And there is really a lot of material out there. And first, I was looking for other meetup groups that may be talking about Jung. And I always found out, like, okay, they very often did not know so much as I did, but I wanted to learn more. And I found there always a lot of people who were interested in the things that I then had to say and had to explain. And I thought, okay, at a certain point, I just make my own group. And that's how I started. And yeah, with time, then we met at an offline event here in Berlin and had a really good time at Holzmarkt an der Spree. And yeah, on a later event, you told me about that you want to do a podcast, which I find really cool because I also have a podcast and I know how hard it is to get it off the ground and to keep it running. And this is why I wanted to support you and come here.
Yeah, I'm really interested in Jung. I think since 10 years ago, and I started reading Man and His Symbols because a friend of mine had it in his library, and I found it just interesting the idea of symbols. That's something me being an artist was really interested in, and I have a lot of books about symbols actually. And I was trying always to understand symbols from different cultures. And what I strike me from Jung is the idea of this collective unconscious and the idea of symbols shared by different cultures. So now that you've been really deep into Jung, for how many time?
I started in the year 2020. So when the pandemic hit, I suddenly had a lot of time, and this is when I started. So it's now my fifth year.
Okay, so you already deep into Jung. So yeah, I think most maybe the audience that listen to me might not be familiar with Jung because yeah, not everybody is into maybe his works. Can you summarize what are the key concepts Jung introduced to modern psychology that people might not be aware of?
Yeah. So Jung himself, he was a Swiss psychologist, lived from 1875 till 1961. So pretty long life and also a pretty productive life. And many know him as a friend of Freud, and they had a very close friendship that then later broke apart. But the things that Jung is famous for is really this idea of the collective unconscious, that there's a shared psychology between all human beings that connect us today also with the people in the past, that they're still the same underground. But also then concepts like the shadow, anima, animus, the self, ions, archetypes in general. And he even coined the terms introversion and extroversion. So these are coming from him. So he contributed really a lot in the beginning of psychology when this was a new field. Um, and yeah, it's when he's being talked about, it's more in this spiritual occult spheres. So there's really when you there's a huge astrology scene which I was also not aware of, but came into contact with through my events, and they're really interested in Jung because he also talked a lot about astrology. But let's say in an academic context, most people say they don't really encounter him. But then it's a question: okay, where do you want to be, with the creative and free thinking people, or with the academic educational people? But yeah, that would be a short introduction into Carl Gustav Jung, who still has an influence for, because let's stay with the collective unconscious. He was already setting up the hypothesis for something like evolutionary psychology, which is a completely valid field today. And he already had these ideas over 100 years ago, that there are certain situations that happened so often in the past that they became ingrained in psychology of all human beings. And the way he proved it was what you already alluded to, that you have different cultures from different times in different geographies that not necessarily had connection to each other, but when they tell stories or have certain symbology, that there's a huge overlap there. And when there can't be a really outside connection, there has to be an inside connection. That's then the psyche. So it seems like there's very strong indication that there are certain symbols and ideas just coming up by themselves as soon as people starting to do cultural work. And this is something that Jung explored, and that has been explored then by many other people like Joseph Campbell, um, mapping the hero's journey through different stories, that there's a unifying structure in there. And this is what draws many people to Jung, to see like, okay, there's some kind of universalism there, that you can really learn something about yourself, but also different cultures, that it's all connected through the psyche. And this is also what I find interesting.
Yeah, I also find I was super interesting for me and surprising when I discovered that. Well, I not discovered, but I read that Jung claimed the idea that we are not blank slates when we are born. Not only these concepts come out when you're doing culture or art, but also he claims that we are born with these symbolic instincts, as far as I know. So, and also I've been lately thinking a lot about culture and globalization. And a friend of I'm doing the podcast about culture and American culture, but my friend told me he don't think that nowadays particular cultures are that important because the world has become more globalized. And I wonder where, I mean, if this idea of collective unconscious also has to do with globalization, or if Jung still make a room for individual cultures, or even thought that it was important to have individual cultures, even though there was a collective unconscious.
Mm. Yeah, it's true that he sees a common core for all human beings, but he still thinks that really the expression of culture is something that is very much bound to specific regions. That there's just, let's say, psychological differences based on where a culture is, for example. That, and you can see it a little bit. Um, that that's so interesting. There's studies about this. For example, how close people stand to each other. And the closer you get to the equator in public, like people who don't know each other, and the closer you get to the equator and the closer you get where it's warm, people stand closer to each other. But the farther you go north where it's cold, people stand farther away from each other. And this is why you have such funny pictures, for example, in Sweden in the winter, where people are waiting for the bus there, but there's like 3 meters between them. And no, he speaks a lot about these things, that there's just it's really, you're not born a blank slate, let's say psychologically wise, but also culturally wise, that you still have in the background your let's say cultural history, and that there's certain psychological needs associated with that. So he was not, let's say, proposing a universal culture, but he was rather saying, okay, people are different, every person is different with a different psychology, different personality, but every group is in a sense different, every culture is different, and this makes it necessary for them to have, let's say, different cultural products that are necessary for their psychological needs. For example, over 100 years ago, when he started, the whole Eastern sphere opened up, like India and China, because these texts got translated into European languages, so people came into contact with them. And he back then already said, okay, we cannot really take over these cultural products completely because we're completely missing the background knowledge of growing up in this culture. So we do not completely understand, or might not completely understand, what they mean from a Western point of view. Because you have, for example, India, 5,000 years of cultural work happening, and they come to a certain conclusion, certain story they want to tell, certain symbols that they use. And it's not that we can now say, okay, I just take the symbol over to Europe and now we use it in a certain way. This was his understanding about cultural differences and psychological differences in cultures. And I think there's just something to it. And you notice your own culture when you go into another culture and be
Sure.
and be somewhere else, right? To see that there's so many presuppositions that you have about how things should be, that you mostly notice them when you go somewhere where it's not self-evident regarding that. So I know if you're a Swedish person and then you go to Latin America and everybody stands very close.
Yeah.
This is then when you realize, oh, okay, these are the unwritten rules, right? And this is then also hard to transport. You have to experience yourself, basically.
Yeah, that's what actually happened to me when I came to Germany, and actually not only happens to me, but I realize I automatically switch when I come to Germany. The idea of being closer or further from people,
Mm.
because when I travel to Latin America, for sure in the bank queues or supermarket queues, people are super close
Mm.
and they don't even mind, and sometimes it might feel annoying, but in the context of Latin America and in Ecuador specifically, it's fine. But when I come here, I remember I came here like last year. I was getting to I think a supermarket, and then when I was moving around, I was putting a big distance between me and the other people. Like it was like, okay, yeah, I know this is your space, this is my space, and I then I realized, okay, I'm doing this automatically. It's not like I made an effort
Mm.
to do that. And the same with sitting next to someone else. Like
Yeah.
here is weird if there is a seat that is free and there is not many people around. You sit next to another person, but in Ecuador, I mean, everybody sits anywhere they can. And yeah, that was something
And you're
interesting.
not allowed to leave. So when it's a full train or bus and there's a free spot and you sit down and there are other spaces coming free and you could switch so that it's less cramped. In Germany, you're not allowed to switch seats.
Why not?
I don't know. I really don't know. But it's I think so. That's just my thinking. This is the stuff you never talk about in a cultural sense, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think it would be offensive that you would start switching seats as soon as another seat is available, and you could decompress the area a little bit. That it is like criticism the person towards. But I don't know why. It's just a feeling that I
Interesting.
have. Yeah. Um, and yeah, this is then the stuff that you normally don't think about unless other people point it out. And I saw it somewhere in a YouTube video that somebody said it, and I said, yeah, that's true. That's 100% true. I've never thought about it like that, but I would not switch seats. So if there are four seats and three are taken and I'm sitting on the fourth and the other two people leave, I would not switch my seat even when I'm right next to the other person. And it would be better for us both that I
Yeah.
go on the other two seats. But that's just like Germany.
Interesting. Yeah, this is super interesting because I was talking to a friend in Japan,
Mm.
and he was telling me there were some similar rules that
Oh, really?
the Japanese follow. Not necessarily, or maybe also about the space, but he was talking something similar about food. When they were eating, if there was a last piece of food on a plate,
Hmm.
they, even though they might want to eat that piece, they might say, "Oh no, thank you, I don't want it,"
Hmm.
because that would be not respectful. But he portrayed that, or not explain that, is a better word, in a sense that people has two personalities, and this has to do with personas with Jung.
Mm.
Yeah, the idea, I forgot the two term, but one personality is the one you present to the society, and the other personality is a personality you maybe show up to a friend,
Mm.
but you don't even show to your family. So the personality you show to other people and the community around you is one that is super respectful and even uh, go over your desires,
Mm.
because you might desire that last piece of food, but it's not respectful to show that you want that piece of
Mm.
food, and you instead try to provide it to other people. So I guess it's a cultural persona
Yeah.
that people like have in different cultures.
Then I would say it's pretty strong also in Germany that you separate like your public life and your private life. So you, I would say it's in contrast to Americans, for example, where you have no separation between public life and private life. I guess that's also why social media could have only started in America. Like a German guy never would have come with social media. It's and the guys who did, they just copied the stuff from America, like StudiVZ and SchülerVZ. If some people can remember that before Facebook took over, it was just copying the stuff that was already there in America. But to have this separation and to be different towards your parents, your friends, strangers, or your work. And this is also something that Jung talked about, and this term persona comes from him. Well, not completely. It's a term that's also super interesting. It's from Greek theater, ancient Greek theater. They had these masks for the actors to separate the person from the role that they're playing. And the reason why it's called persona is because they had a little mouthpiece in the mask to amplify the voice. And it's two words personare, to through sound. And this then became associated with the mask, and then of course it became associated with the social mask that people wear. And Jung described it as something that, yeah, one is presenting of oneself towards the world to ideally show positive things, but there's also automatically an expectation that society has just by seeing and observing you. For example, if you look like a doctor, society will have certain expectations of how you should behave, for example, in an emergency situation. And this is nothing that you necessarily would desire then to do in the uh, emergency situation, but I think it's very likely, otherwise people would not become doctors. But there would be an expectation to, okay, you need the help because you're the expert in this situation. And so he says the persona is a kind of compromise between oneself and the expectations of society. And it's also a form of politeness because you don't want to overburden every person with your whole history, your whole personality, and all your problems. So it's a sign that you're well socialized and cultured by when somebody asks you how you're doing, not saying like all the problems that you have in your life, but rather saying, "Oh, I'm fine," or "I'm okay."
I heard actually that it was a meme. I'm not sure it's true.
Okay.
But if you ask a German, how are you? They start telling you really how they are.
Mm. Yeah, because Germans are honest.
It's true.
Even when it's not the right time to be honest, but yeah, it's like the American style would rather be, oh yeah, I'm fine. How are you doing, and so on. So this is something that I also noticed when I went to America. This is not necessarily a question in Germany that you would do ask so often, like, oh, how are you doing? How's your life right now? But in America, it's just like throwaway. It's just like saying hello. And yeah, in Germany, you can get quite the honest answers about it. And then you don't know what to do.
Yeah, this is interesting because also I discussed this with a friend from America. I think that the idea that in America, even Latin America as well, it's more common to start a conversation with small talk.
Hmm.
But I think it's in the northern countries in Europe, small talk is perceived as annoying. So either you go really go into an interesting conversation of, or yeah, better not to speak in a sense. But I'm not sure if that's what a friend of mine told me from living in Sweden, for example.
Hmm.
Small talk, it was like,
Yeah, there's also what I heard about. We were talking a lot about Sweden
yeah,
today, but yeah, the Scandinavian countries, it's a little bit different. Like I had Swedish in university, and there was also a German guy who lived in Sweden for some time, and he pointed out all the things that are konstigt, that are a little bit strange in Sweden. For example, I found this very interesting. Uh, when you have an apartment building, like here, an apartment block, and you have the stairs, and of course you have to use the stairs to go out. That in Sweden, people would watch if somebody is in the stairs, and they would not leave the apartment till the person is gone, the stairs are free, and then they go out. And so that's really interesting. So I would not care, but it seems to be very important in Swedish culture not to encounter people in the stairs in the apartment building. And also, the worst thing also was if you would go somewhere to do a sleepover and you don't bring your own um, um, uh, like bedlaken.
yeah,
What's the
like
English one? Yeah,
uh,
the cloth for
yeah,
the
you
pillow and the
bed
blankets,
sheets,
bed
yeah,
sheets. Yes,
yeah,
that would be a horrible offense, and people would horribly offended if you would expect them to have some
right,
for you. And those are all the nice things you can like learn about other cultures.
yeah, yes, for sure. But this is, I mean, also interesting because as far as I read from Jung, he was referring to personas in the professional life sense, or maybe in relationship to a particular role in your
Mm.
society. But I don't know if he talk about personas in the term of cultural personas.
In cultural, I'm not sure right now. I don't think so. It's mostly really function yourself in society. So he said men are especially prone to getting lost in their persona, that they think, okay, it's only the function that I do in society, which also gets rewarded with money and status and titles and all these things. That's all that there is to me, psychologically wise. I only need to be what I appear to others, but not that the person is also a person in itself and has its own psychology. And they said that men are really prone to that, um, that they need to discover also their internal life.
Interesting, because uh, so the persona is not only a role you play in a society, in a given society, but also it's something that you can become get lost into,
Mm.
and you forget what you really want. So can you talk about a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a huge part of Jungian psychology and the things that he talked about. Um, that there are things that can just pull you along, that can, let's say, possess you, which means that there are some forces in the psyche that act autonomously and not necessarily in your interest. Let's say an emotion, for example. When you're hungry, you're 100% hungry when you're really enough hungry. Or if you're angry or when you're happy, it just sweeps you along and it shapes your whole worldview and how you act. And he sees it more complex also with archetypes, or for example with a persona. That there's just your psychology is basically hijacked and pulled into a certain direction, but you don't necessarily realize that because you're trapped in there in this psychological mood. Um, and the reason why he was telling this is to make people aware of that so that they can start to differentiate between the things that are happening around them and themselves and the things that are happening inside them and themselves. For example, he says people can, for example, never leave their family psychology. They always stay psychologically a child. And when a child is born, it's first an extension of the body of the mother, but he says even after birth, it's an extension of the psychology of a mother. And the child needs to separate from the mother and the family circle, then to go into the broader world. And this means leaving behind the infantile tendencies and being aware that there's even this connection to persons or to things. And similar with the persona, it can be very enticing, especially I would say today when you, for example, have an incredibly successful podcast and people approach you on the street and tell you how awesome you are. It could be that you start believing it and your whole ego gets inflated because you don't see yourself, but rather you see yourself how others see you. But at the same time, you're also only presenting the positive things. Yeah. So, but there's still all the dark, the shadow stuff that Jung then talked about, which is still there, needs to be dealt with. And if you're not dealing with it, it starts pushing against you into the direction that would be most healthy for you, that you're content with the things that you do not content with or don't want to content with. So yeah, that's a pretty big thing for Jung.
Yeah, that's super interesting because I have two ideas about that. First, in the sense of culture, what what are the things that define your inner life, the touch of culture, and the outer life that is a touch of culture? Because for sure, Jung claims that you are born with a collective unconscious, and this collective unconscious is also attached to culture. So how cannot you get lost with this person? I'm making the claim there is a cultural persona. I'm not sure if there's a cultural persona, but if you are basically behaving in this cultural persona and you say, okay, I want to look inside myself to see who I really am, and you find in the inside yourself that you are also not a blank slate, but you are born with these symbols. How can you really not get lost in this?
Yeah, that's a hard thing, and that's a difficult thing. This is why Jung says this journey that he calls individuation, to become an individual, to become basically oneself, and this means to separate oneself from the outside forces or the inside forces, or let's say at least being able to separate and seeing it as an outside thing. Why it's never finished. It's a continuous process and a back and forth between, let's say, two opposites. You can be too much oriented towards the outside world or too much oriented towards the inward world. You can be too much interested in labeling things, what he calls thinking, or too much oriented towards feeling, where he says, okay, how do I relate to something? Is it positive or is it negative? And being lost in the unconscious is a real danger.
Also,
Yeah, he wants about it a lot. So he speaks about the unconscious. It sounds all very interesting and very cool. I can't deny it. It sounds very, very cool. But at the same time, he also warns against, okay, this can really hijack you. And his view, for example, on schizophrenia, which was called dementia praecox in the past, was really that these unconscious forces from the collective unconscious are just so strong and so overwhelming that they break apart consciousness and people get unavailable for the outside world. So for him, schizophrenia was necessarily like um, being catatonic. So like no contact with the outside world, completely trapped within oneself. Uh, this makes it then difficult when you encounter these things from the collective unconscious, which is the culture bearing ground where creative stuff happens, that this first is a shock to people because it's very foreign, it's very strange, it has nothing to do with the person, it's impersonal, it's on a deeper level, on a more universal level. And people who encounter these things are then artists or, let's say, prophets, as you can see where a culture might be moving towards. Because it's the underground that's everywhere and it's also shifting and changing all the time. Like he said, he found very strange dreams in his German patients before National Socialism. That he said, oh, there's something happening collectively in the German culture, and he could see it in the dream because dreams are also a source of unconscious contents, also from collective contents. And it's not an easy thing to do something creative, especially when it's, let's say, era defining, zeitgeist defining, and people can get lost. And this is why culture is there. Culture as a way to mitigate and channel these collective unconscious experiences and let people experience them in a safe way. Because it's one thing if you encounter a wild animal in your bedroom or you encounter it in a zoo, for example. The question is how dangerous is it for one? And he said like human culture with religion and institutions and rituals and traditions is there to give room to these collective forces to express themselves in a positive way, and that this takes a very long time for human beings to figure it out. Like, okay, what is it and how to deal with it? And this is really where he sees culture as a protection for human beings against these unconscious forces that can overwhelm them and basically rip apart their consciousness and then their ability to interact with the outside world.
Yeah, that's super interesting because okay, what is culture nowadays from the point of view of globalization?
Yeah.
It's complex because I will argue that now we live more outside than inside. Not only because globalization, but also because this social media. And I find I have the intuition that this might not be psychologically beneficial for people not to be able to express these symbols that they have inside that are fighting, how you say, to come out. And this is interesting that they come out as culture. So what happens that if not only you don't express your the symbological um, uh, I don't know ideas or concepts you have inside, but also you are superimposed with a more diluted
Hmm.
global culture, and also that started in I think in Germany with Bauhaus, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of things started in Germany, like Protestantism. So that already breaking away from older structures. So yeah, the question really is, we're still generating culture, like all the time. Every one of us, at least that's how I see it. Even with the social media and all these things, it's a lot of people trying to figure out things and how to behave and live in a world and like build a value hierarchy, stuff like that. The thing is, which is special today, is that um, we have a culture which is not completely new, same as human beings are not born as a blank slate. The cultures all have a history of hundreds of thousands of years. So, and I think these cultural products are not available to us in the same degree as they have been in the past.
Yeah.
Because a lot of things was very likely person to person. So when you lived in, I don't know, 4 generational household in your village, and it was over hundreds of years, you also have a stable environment where you can create lasting values of lasting traditions.
Yeah.
But by now, the change is so quick and so rapid um, that it's even, let's say, difficult for grandparents, parents, and children to understand each other. That sounds like a hyperbole, but by now the whole sphere of culture has so fragmented. When I talk to my grandmother, like she watches television, listens to the radio, and uses the newspapers. And this, until recently, was the backbone of culture. Like this is what all people interacted with. And I don't watch television, I don't read the newspaper, and I don't listen to radio. So, um, so when she starts talking about things and complaining about things, I don't know what she's talking about. And
Yeah.
that makes it then pretty hard. I guess people are really more isolated, and this is really the first time in human history that families been so separated. So what I heard about Freud and one interpretation of Freud and why he became well necessary and successful is the problems that he's describing are new to human beings. That you have this atomizing, that it's not only a family, but outside of, let's say, a village context. That you can have something like a devouring mother because there's no other female persons really to take care and pay attention to it.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Can you
And
explain about the devouring mother?
the devouring mother. So the idea from Freud is really it's then the mother that does not want the child to leave, basically. So to hinder development and self-sufficiency and so on. Because what is a mother without a child, right? And at a certain point, a child is so big that it will develop so much that it will leave. So it can be a pathology in Freudian psychology that a mother will consciously or unconsciously hinder the development of the child so that it will stay a child and it will not move past the family psychology so that the mother won't be alone and might not be a mother anymore. And this is different, at least that's what I think, when you have, let's say, just bigger families and a village context where other people are also watching. Right?
Okay.
So, for example, when you have 10 children, you can't really devour them because there's too many. But if you only have one child, you can really be the helicopter parent that's there 24/7. And in the past, just people had way more children. So this is just the what I meant with the situation changed. So the culture also needs to change, and we need to re-explore certain things and rediscover certain things to have then something. And maybe that will take 100 years or 500 years. But then we know, like, oh yeah, so now we know how to deal with the problems of the year 2000 when social media came up and all those things. So I think this is still happening all in the background. And but it will take time, and likely we won't see it.
Yeah, this is interesting that Freud could see that. But did Freud saw the trajectory of, I guess, cities becoming more a space for fragmentation of individuals, or what was his argument?
Well, Freud did not speak so much like on a global or bigger scale. He mostly saw like subjective individual psychology, and he saw those problems of the devouring mother, for example. It was an interpretation that I heard from someone else about the work of Freud. So Freud might not have been aware of this development necessarily, but he contributed to understand it. Like Freud is one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, which had a huge influence. It was more Jung that thought about the implications, what it meant, how society developed. So he was very much against cities.
Oh, really?
Yes, he was also against apartments because he said people cannot express themselves in an apartment in a city because people are already removed from nature and the natural state of things. Not that he said that the natural state of things is the best way to live. But he said the psychology that people have is complex, and a lot of it is in the past. Um, so this also has to be taken care of. Like everything you don't take care of will start to interfere with you, with your plans, your ideas, with your life.
Yeah, this is also something that I guess noted in Latin America from the point of view of symbols. Um, I guess because here in Europe, industrialization has gone for a longer time than in
Mm.
Latin America, we still have a connections to symbology that is sounds might be more archaic and more um I don't know how to put it. It's a weird symbology.
Mm.
We still talk about um healing traditions that are old, or people still might fear a shaman, or might be no might respect a shaman.
Mm.
Like I will guess that in Europe most people will dismiss it like, yeah, shaman.
Yeah, I guess there was also something like this in Europe, but likely it's gone by now. Maybe if you are in the rural areas, in the villages, you might strongly disagree. And I don't know how it is because I did not grow up in a village. Um, but I guess if you really look somewhere there rural, you might still have something like that, but it's not, let's say, broadly available to everyone, especially when you live in a big city like Berlin.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, this is the thought is just interesting that human beings operated like this for since human beings and human cultures exist, and we just recently stopped with that. Like,
Yeah.
what are the implications?
Yeah, but also something that didn't realize until lately is that I don't think in at least in Germany there are indigenous ancient cultures like in Latin America there are tribes in the jungle still living there like the past. So even if there is industrialization in the cities in Latin America
Mm.
that is going fast, there are still there are still tribes that are behaving like ancient times.
Yes, yes. No, that's true, and that's very interesting. This is also where Jung investigated. He went to those tribes and he went to also Latin America to see, okay, how do they live, right? How is their psychology? Because he said that's still in us even today. Like we look very fancy, we drive cars, we live in big cities, all this stuff, and we work on computers. But deep down, we are still have this psychology of living in a tribe and living somewhere in the forest and the for Jung, many modern problems stem from the fact that we do not tend to this side that it's trying to get pushed away and ignored. To say that there's a archaic side to human beings.
Yeah. Yeah, another thing that I think for me is interesting from the point of view of Jung is the idea of intuition.
Hmm.
Um, I wonder if in today's society, since we are being pushed to be more rational and to follow method of thinking, we are more, for sure, not thinking about intuition or these emotions, and in a sense, we are making them like we consider them to be not important.
Hmm.
And as far as I know, you thought that was a problem and that created psychological problems.
Yeah. One thing is like in Western Europe, Jung talks about that is um, like Christianity um, was the dominant culture for a very long time, and one staple of Catholicism is you do not have individual revelations. Like any individual revelation makes you basically a heretic. So um, this put all the symbol and cultural work in the church, and what people experience for themselves is most likely of the devil.
Wow.
And this, of course, forms then the relationship that people then have with individual revelations that they can have and experiences. Um, of course, it is necessary. Like the Christian church was incredibly important to foster consciousness and being able to um, gain a certain world view that everybody has. It's like installing the same operating system everywhere. It has a huge advantage for people to interact with each other, also to form willpower and consciousness and being aware. So this is all good and fine, but the bad side, of course, is you don't have these individual relationship that they then form with, for example, any eternal being, as it always goes through the church and Catholicism. And that's why he said at a certain point Protestantism evolved, because there you can have this direct relationship. Of course, now you don't have one unified operating system anymore, but rather everybody creates their own operating system. This is why you have not the Protestant church, but you have many denominations that all have very different views and ideas and put the focus on different things. Having these individual experiences is something that Jung also talked about. Is not typical in today's world to do it on a voluntary basis, but rather an involuntary. Like you don't pay attention, so the psyche just pushes the stuff to you, and it is through the intuitive function. Like Jung saw 4 functions how information comes to consciousness, which is thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And intuition is the one really associated with the unconscious, and it's about the possibility what something could be. For example, he says sensation is very easy. Like you realize there is something. Thinking is labeling and saying, oh, this is a table. Feeling is how do I relate to the table? And say, I like this table because it's holding up my glass and the microphone and everything. And intuition would be, okay, what else could this be? Where does this table come from? What could it be in the future? How else could I use it? So it's more of a creative function. And because it's associated with the unconscious, it's perceiving through the unconscious. And this is where then the symbols and so on come from the unconscious. So, but Jung says this is something that you can learn. Like all the functions, you can learn how to become proficient in them. Everybody has their favorite function, like everybody has their favorite hand just when they're born. But he says to really experience the world completely and live in it, you need to be able to use all those functions like tools. And this is then something you need to learn. But people then shy away from it because if you cannot do something proficient, let's say I'm left-handed, if I do something with my right hand, it's super awkward. It looks stupid, I feel stupid, so I don't do it, right? That doesn't mean I could learn it with my right hand, but I'm less likely to do it. And this is, he says, it's just how human beings operate. Like when they're a thinking type, they do try to solve all the problems with thinking, right? They have the hammer, so they try to treat everything as a nail. So, but you need all the different tools. So to get over this resistance and to act like a fool and to be awkward is the necessary step that you need to do to gain proficiencies than in the other functions, as for example intuition.
Yeah, but I don't think that the systems we have now, like help someone to develop the other intuition, because with thinking you might say school teach you to think, but they don't tell you, oh, use your intuition for this assignment, or use your feelings for this assignment. On the contrary, if you you say I'm using my feelings in a job situation, for example, that might seem unprofessional. So I wonder if now most society is being possessed by a thinking persona.
No, it's being channeled in a certain direction, and some functions are then put on a higher pedestal, and those are the rational functions, such as thinking for Jung. But yeah, it's like, okay, how do you teach someone intuition? That's pretty hard. So I would guess it would be if you do something creative and do a creative endeavor, because then things start to unfold. And this is the very, very cool thing. When you do something creative, that things start to happen all by themselves. You set out to do something, and on the other end comes out something completely different. So you're an artist, you draw. So I think you even understand it better, what I mean. But this is the very cool thing, to say like, oh, I did not plan it, but it turned out some way, and even it turned out good. So
Yeah.
and yeah, to teach that. So we had in German school system we have art, where we but it was mostly painting or drawing, or maybe a little bit
Sculpting.
what's it called sculpting, yeah. Um, but not much else, and it was mostly assignment based.
Also in Ecuador, the same is I think the school system is ubiquitous in all cultures, and also wonder if, for sure, the system we share because of globalization has helped a lot in the economic sense for a lot of countries, because I can see my country being more developed. There is more cars, there is more buildings, but I wonder if these systems that are trying to fit every culture
Mm.
are at the same time hindering the maybe the positive aspect or the strengths of of these cultures. Um, yeah, because something we discussed already is the idea of, okay, in German culture, this idea of space is important, or maybe there are other aspects of it. But what my friend told me, he's from Ecuador, he lives in Japan. He was
Yeah.
talking about Latin American being more maybe fast into thinking, and maybe while being fast, you also make more mistakes. But in German culture is the contrary. You plan way ahead, so and you also overthink about the things that might go wrong, and then you execute.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder if the or also I don't know what is the global culture we share. What is this globalization culture? Because it's an economic system mostly,
Yeah.
and also maybe an technological system. But I'm not sure what are the different parts of it. I
Yeah.
guess. So what do you? Yeah, maybe this is an abstract question.
Yeah. No, I understand what you mean. Um, it looks very homogenized, right? I can travel everywhere, and especially in the big cities, looks very similar. Like all the same services are available. You have similar kinds of restaurants, for example. The kind of things you expect and you see are the same. So the question is, even if you go into like a big city, like the capital of a country, have you interacted with the culture?
Yeah.
Um, and it's turbocharged because of the internet and social media, and it's, I would say, very Americanized.
Yeah, it is.
A lot of the culture comes from the Americans, and they're also very good at it. Like like the American
Yeah.
movies, they're good, and the American music is also good. It's like not the only music there, but if I would say like the world had to survive on German culture, it would be a little bit sad. A little bit,
No,
a
but
little bit. But
in a way, it's also German culture. I mean, American culture, because a lot of Germans move, millions of Germans move to uh, the U.S.
yes,
Basically, that's what formed the basis of the culture as well.
yeah, there's of course a huge German influence also in America. It was also super interesting. There was a time when you wanted to be successful in America, for example, in politics, you had to study in Germany in a university. So this is already 150 years ago or something like that, because they did not have the institutions in America, but in Germany the university system comes from Germany. There were way more universities with more prestige and more education. Um, but yeah, there's like everybody is wearing the same clothes, having
Yeah. Yes.
technology, and yeah, the question is really what will be the result. And when I read Jung, he talks a lot about how different, for example, the Eastern uh, mind is in contrast to the Western mind. And if I would look at it today, I would say I don't see it so much differently. Like I have contact with Chinese people, Japanese people, Korean people, Taiwanese people, and especially when you have younger people, they're all very similar. Like when you have older people, they're like older Japanese people, they're very special.
Yeah.
um, But the question is really, okay, are we homogenizing everything, and is that a good thing? Like, what will be the consequences? And I think nobody really knows. Like, you cannot escape it. You cannot escape the internet, and you cannot escape the global markets. Um, but it's, for example, what you're doing right now. You using the new technologies to explore your culture and what it means to be born and living or growing up in Latin America, but then being in another country, like and try to get a perspective. Okay, what does it mean? Or what makes Latin America special? So I think this is just an innate drive that people automatically have. Like, I guess nobody is satisfied in saying, okay, like, I'm now 100% Americanized, but I'm not in America, and I'm completely satisfied. People still have it in the back of their mind. They're still, oh, like, my grandmother or my grandfather did it like this, and but because you still have all this history, you still have it attached. So I guess it will be a pendulum where you have maybe more homogenization, but then we already see that globalization is slowing down and that more
Yes.
countries are turning inward, and also reshoring of industry and production. This is a huge topic right now, especially in context of semiconductors, for example. So I think this is all just a question of time. This is we only see snapshots, like, and if we would step back and see it, then not in monthly basis, but yearly, 5 year, 20, 50 year basis, we would get a very different picture. But it's then interesting to be in the time and to create
Yeah.
and to create something like the way we talk now. We can only talk now this way. In a month or a year or 5 years, we would have a very much different conversation.
Yeah. But also the crazy thing is that now it's normal there are multinational companies. I work in Berlin where people are from different countries,
No,
and also having these multicultural cities where everybody speak English because it's become the most spoken language for I guess business. Um, this is super interesting. Like we live in a time that maybe we take for granted.
no.
The idea, oh yeah, I speak with someone from Germany, or I understand. Even if I don't live there, I go to the internet. I understand the person from the other world because not only is the language is close, but also the ideas we share are similar. So this is super new for
Mm.
us. Um, but yeah, thinking back about Jung, I was wondering, uh, what are the things Jung um, thought, or what are the theories Jung come up with that turn out to be not like they are deprecated, that not doesn't work anymore.
It doesn't work anymore. There's one theory where I'm really not sure. I'm pretty sure that it does not work, but he told it many times. Like back in the day, tuberculosis was a huge issue. Yes, and it's still a huge issue in big parts of the world, but like in the Western world, not anymore, thanks to antibiotics. And he had this theory that tuberculosis comes from bad ventilation of the lungs. And he noticed when people have psychological problems, like a complex, for example, that their breathing is affected um, in first. Like that there are certain bodily symptoms to psychological problems, and
Mm.
one of them is, for example, shallow breathing. And he then associated an outbreak of tuberculosis with shallow breathing caused by a psychological problem. Um, I don't know the status of like psychological research papers, but I guess this is a theory that did not help up so much. But there's a hypothesis in there that makes sense, and it's true that the breathing changes when people have psychological problems, and also that people can have bodily problems caused by psychological problems. But his idea regarding tuberculosis was interesting, and I think it's not very up to date anymore.
Yeah, and also another thing that I find interesting about Jung, that he, and also not only Jung but also the psychologists that were like coming up at the time, is this idea of the Western way. of seeing the world.
Mm.
Um, because Jung, in a sense, was a little bit more a mystic, and he talk about a lot of ideas that maybe are not that rational.
Mm.
And but for me, it's super interesting that psychology came about in Germany or the German-speaking countries,
Yeah.
because before the mind was being or the ideas of the mind were not explored in a particular discipline.
Mm.
And there is Freud, there is Jung, and also the fire psychology that his name escapes me. Also, a lot of the tradition of psychology really.
The German-speaking countries. So, and there again, Jung also has a theory. um, looking at the history of Europe, um, he said, if you look into the countries that were really conquered by the Romans, like Italy, Spain, France, um, that they operate different than the Germans, which were never really conquered by the Romans, because they were on the other side of the Rhine. They stayed a little bit more primitive in that way. Uh, he says you had the Germanic tribes in Germany living in the forest, living how human beings lived for thousands or 10,000s of years. And when the Romans came, they basically forced, or the Christians, they basically forced um, the Christian mindset onto them. And it's possible to make people conform, right? So, but it's one thing whether a culture grows out of yourself and out of the population, or something is being put on top. And Jung's view was that you have the Germanic people who, in their heart, were still pagans, but on the outside, they had to become Christian just to operate in the world and to be part of the world. But this rift never really got overcome. So this idea of you have to force yourself to believe something, not something is so convincing that it's coming out of yourself and it's self-evident that it's true, but rather it's you have to force yourself to believe something, and it's a sign that you really, even though it does not make sense, you believe it. He saw there as a source that there's a rift in the former Germanic tribes in the psychology, that you have the conscious side, which is very Christianized, but then the unconscious side, which is still very pagan, which caused this layer of civilization and cultural to be very thin. So this is why in Germany, for him, this was thrown off as soon as possible. Like with Protestantism, it's already like, okay, let's get rid of Christianity in that form, and we'll make it, but a little bit different, right? So he saw psychology and psychologically problems coming up first in this area of Europe because of this very special history. Like we talked before in the beginning, that every culture has a history, and this has still an influence. And he says in the past there was not really an unconscious, and there was no need for psychology. It was first with the death of these metaphysical structures that they're going away, that suddenly people are alone against the unconscious and the collective unconscious, and suddenly it comes up.
What do you mean by these metaphysical structures that went away?
Basically, the death of God, like Nietzsche
Okay.
proclaimed. So that you have the structures, but they lost their, let's say, influence. That people stopped believing in them, maybe in a voluntary or involuntary manner. So suddenly, all the people had individual revelations. Like religion is there to prevent people from having religious experiences. This is the idea of Jung. And when you take that away, suddenly people have all these amazing experiences coming up, and in effort to understand them and to make sense of them, this is in his eyes how psychology was born. But also for the necessity
Wow.
of the modern mind to understand what is happening. Because he says this is really the modern mind. Why is something like this? I want to understand. I want to learn. And many things, let's say cultural in the past, or rituals, they're just self-evident. They're just being done because they always have been done. So psychology is just a modern language to explain then these phenomena and also to reconnect people to their past. Because this is also what we see a lot. For example, when people analyze mythology or stories or history through a psychological lens, they try to reconnect what lies in the past with the present because there's value in these things. And psychology is right now the language that we use to try to make it approachable. Like, for example, John Peterson was incredibly successful talking about the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Incredibly, that people watched it for hours. These stories that are thousands of years, even older, some stories 10,000 of years, and people are completely amazed and engrossed because it's looked through a psychological lens. And this is, in my eyes, why psychology has become so big and created also so much demand for it. Like I have a group with 850 people who really want to learn about Jung and what Jung has to say about psychology. And there are a lot of other people who talked about and had amazing theories and ideas. And people are really drawn to that in all aspects of their lives to understand, like the modern mind, trying to understand why is there something and why is it like that.
Yeah, that's super. Also interesting that the I would call it the symbol of the shaman is coming back as well,
Hmm.
because psychedelics and ayahuasca is being talked to about here in, at least in Europe and in the US. And I don't think that maybe 30 years ago people were aware of this or
Hmm.
really even thought, oh, okay, there is something there. But also trying to do research, scientific research about these
Yeah.
components. Um, this is something interesting for me. Another thing that we have discussed before is that um, the tradition of the cultures, at least in the Amazon, it was to make conscious the unconscious through substances
Hmm.
and through plants. Um, Also, I've been researching a little bit about what is the psychology of these. I I still call it shaman, but they don't call them shamans because shaman is a, a Russian word. I'm not Russian, but from the culture that before Russia as it is. But in my culture, for example, they are called taitas or yacha. And the idea is they also talk in psychological terms if
Hmm.
you really pay attention. Because I was listening to this guy who became a shaman from the U.S. He decided that he had a call one day. I say, oh, I need to go to the jungle in Peru, and he basically got adventures. I found a shaman, and he trained with a shaman for 7 years.
Hmm.
So sometimes he goes into YouTube channels to talk about shamanism, and it is super interesting because a lot of things he says sound super crazy. Like, and you hear heard them talking about, oh, I was training with this shaman and also the apprentice beside me. And one day I was traveling to Europe, and they pop up in my conscious and starts telling me, "Oh, hello, how are you doing?" And this is a crazy idea, but and I don't know what to make about that. But there are other concepts that I find they are basically psychological techniques, if you call it. For example, I was in the jungle. I had to take different plants because I was with the shaman for a couple of weeks, and I don't remember the name of this particular plant, but I had to take baths with this plant. And
Baths.
baths, you take baths,
Okay.
and before going to sleep. And basically, actually, you sleep with all the plant
Oh,
in your
okay.
body. And I remember one day I was laying down there, and I was um, feeling a lot of love. Like I was feeling literally like in my heart, like I was feeling the place. I was thinking about the place,
Okay.
but and not in an abstract way, but oh, I was thinking about my friend giving me a hug, my mom giving me a hug, my people giving hugs and being happy, and I was thinking like in a cycle, and I don't know if you have experienced like a negative cycle where you feel bad and you feel it was the reverse of that. It was the reverse. Oh, I don't feel bad. I feel when you are maybe anxious about something, but it was the contrary in the other way. And I am telling you this because this shaman was telling that in shamanism they believe that there is a difference between the brain and the heart. So the heart, basically, he said, if you have to think about the heart like um, a field of energy, if we can call it that, and the brain is resting on this field. So if you think about this emotion of your heart, and you pay more attention maybe to intuitions and feelings, then you can see the world in a different lens, and maybe you can solve some psychological problems. And that struck me like, okay, if I explain this as a technique, and maybe people start making studies about how to focus yourself and your mind to remember the hug of your friend. This is a technique you can do because I've done this a couple of times and it works when I don't feel good. It works, like I say. Well,
Hugging a friend?
no, no, no. The thinking about it, even
Oh,
thinking
only
about
thinking about it.
thinking about it, but really deeply, really thinking again and again and again. In the reverse of being anxious and feeling bad about something that happened, so being guilty, but it was the contrary, and that happened with a plant. That was triggered by a plant, and I think there is a lot of information and a lot of concepts that, as you said, that are brought now by psychology, and maybe they are in the collective unconscious already. Because how did I know about this, and how did I learn about this? And then they are brought up not only by introspection, like the maybe I would say German tradition of seeing the world, but in the tradition of tribes or Latin American culture is more about, oh, you take out plants and I start thinking in different ways. Oh, I think this other plant, and I my mindset changed because I also had to take different other plants, and my mindset changed completely different. Like I had to take tobacco, and I got super anxious and I was in terror. So these different plants basically changed my mindset, and it's not like the shaman told me, "Oh, you have to think in this way." He didn't even say words, and even if I would try to extract a word from him, it was difficult because he spoke in symbols. Basically, he said, "Oh, we are talking about getting to the light, or you are going to get clean, and you are being going to be happy." And it was like it was complex to talk about all this with this person in person, this shaman, but I came to understand more about this concept just because I saw this other shaman who was basically brought up on the Western culture of the because he's from the U.S. and he's doing these podcasts sometimes and talking about it. So yeah, and this is interesting. For me, it's interesting that now people are looking about to these medicine and plants back again, and I guess maybe this idea that you said about how psychology is connecting to the collective unconscious and connected to culture, and how these things are cycles are maybe coming back. And yeah, so but yeah, I and also I think this. I don't think there is, even though there is a tradition in Latin America to take certain plants or medicines to change your mindset. I think also nowadays people, in a way, are trying to do that with drugs as well. Like,
Yeah, it's this kind of research is coming up more and more, and it's interesting to see because I think this is stuff that not necessarily was written down. So I don't know whether such a tradition existed in Germany. Maybe there is somewhere. If I go now in the forest, there's a plant that would expand my consciousness, my
Mushrooms.
awareness. Yeah, um, but yeah, likely some mushrooms. But I would not be aware of any German tradition where this is part that you eat special mushrooms. So maybe it's something that was done very privately, hidden, right? Or maybe all the plants were eaten. um, but yeah, it would be interesting to see. Yeah, I also saw this kind of research being done now. Um, I think it's just a human way to investigate and find out and to understand more and more. Of course, this can also go into bad directions. Like there, when you do some research on viruses that coming from bats, for example,
Ah,
that could have some potential negative consequences for everyone in the world. But that's just the human spirit to try to investigate and to understand. And I think I'm pretty open to say, okay, this also should be explored, especially if it's been done in the past. So there's one book that I really wanted to read. It was called The Immortality Key, and it's about the Eleusinian myths in Greek, in ancient
Brian
Greece.
Murakami.
I think so, yeah. I think we talked about it before. Yeah, and it sounded super interesting because you had some really smart people like I think Socrates who said that this is very big part why ancient Greece was ancient Greece with the philosophy and the cultural development and all these things, but you were not allowed to talk about it, and it was just a mystery that you did from person to person basically. But this is now lost to us, and the only way how it's available to us today is because they can now investigate the like cups and vases and all different instruments that they used in these mysteries to check, okay, what kind of chemicals are in there, because the ceramics are gonna absorb always a bit, and they can find now these spiked wine, and they can see, okay, this could be these plants used in that way, and that's interesting to think about, that there might be this past that was unspoken about, but that was ubiquitous, but never written down, and thus, of course, becomes lost, for example, through industrialization. So, one thing I also have to think about in America, you really do not have so good restaurants. It's like the restaurant culture is not so good. At least where I was, when you maybe in a bigger city, you have the chance to have some international restaurants, but very often it's fast food. And you have to think about, okay, like everybody who came to America is an immigrant, and everybody came from a culture that already had some dishes and some other things. Um, but what they did not have in America was the ingredients. So when they came to America, they maybe had the recipes, but they could not cook the dishes. So at a certain point, they just get lost because you do not cook the dishes. And yeah, so you now have this now very reduced palette of food in America because it would have to come out of the earth. So maybe the Native Americans would have been a better source to explain, okay, what are the good dishes of the land. And I see it similar for something like these mysteries that people have or had, that were completely cultural important for the psychology of the people and the groups and the villages and so on. But now people moved into the cities and worked the whole day, and a couple of generations, it's just the knowledge is gone. Um, so yeah, it's like a huge experiment right now, changing everything at once. And let's see where it will really bring us. But this makes it so interesting to learn about people who investigated that and thought about that, to say, okay, what are the implications and what could maybe be doing differently.
Yeah, one thing that I really appreciate about Jung is that he didn't dismiss what people might consider crazy when we're talking about emotions and the feelings and symbols. That I remember an interview when he said that he had a patient and she was a young lady talking about snakes inside her belly,
Mm.
and I really like that because I don't know how many people might had all these symbols and unconscious ideas they are not channeling in the right way,
Yeah.
and maybe they are more prone to psychological issues. Or, and I really like that also because uh, yeah, in Latin America there is still people talking about symbols and all these things, and I I like the idea of analyzing this in the psychological lens
Mm.
to bring in to the modernity and say, okay, maybe there is something there we shouldn't dismiss as
Yeah.
well. So yeah.
I think this is also why Jung is so ubiquitous and you can find it everywhere. And there are really like different camps of people who are interested in Jung for very different reasons. And I see this when I do the events and there are different topics. They're sometimes completely different crowds. Of course, there are some people who always join and participate, but sometimes you get like hyper specific topics where people come and really blossom, like astrology I mentioned. And yeah, this was because Jung took it all 100% serious. He said everything that human beings experience and everything that they produce is a product of the psyche. And he wanted to understand the psyche. Like Freud was very dismissive, for example, in context of religion. He said it's basically a father complex, and that's all. It's the need for authority and a wish fulfillment. And Jung said, no, it's very different. It says about our psychological condition, and this is why they also split because their differences became just too big. And I remember this case. Yeah, they talked about the case with the lady who came to him and said she has a snake in her stomach, and he took her seriously. But he could also say he could heal her because she was already saying, "This is crazy. I know how it sounds like, but I have the feeling there's a huge snake in my stomach." And he said, "Okay, at least she's aware that she's not identical with that." So this is what I meant earlier when Jung speaks about being able to differentiate oneself from an emotion, an experience, and saying this is not necessarily me and it's not necessarily 100% true. I'm able to think about it objectively as something separate from me. And there you said, um, if she would have come and said, "There's a snake in my stomach," and nobody believes me, then he would have said, "Okay, this is now a way harder case." But
Schizophrenic.
this is because there's no understanding there that there's a separation, right? There's an intermingling because of internal revelation and experience and like the bodily. But he said because she was able to say, "Okay, this might sound crazy, but no one is listening to me." He was completely open to that, and yeah, that makes it just interesting to read about. Like I had no interest in astrology, but when he talks about astrology, it's super interesting, and I see. And then I started also to talk to people who were really into astrology, and it's a huge system, and there's like cutting edge ideas, and there's development and so on, and I think that's nice. It's just passionate people having a hobby. Like nobody's being hurt by people being interested in astrology, but people.
Only some people are giving money for this.
Yeah, but then again, there's a need there. There's a psychological need. People talked thousands of years ago about astrology, and today also, and they that means there is something there, and it does not make sense to just push it away and say like, oh, this is stupid. Don't waste your time on that. But rather, okay, there is something which is just talking to this individual person, and this needs to be explored. And this is what Jung was very open about, and this is how he came in all of these different fields and why he's still being used. Because I have nothing where he was really dismissive about, except for apartments. but yeah, like he lived in central Switzerland over 100 years ago. Of course, he liked to sail on his boat on the lake and complain about city people.
That's way better. That's something that I remember now that this is a huge conversation maybe for another podcast, but the idea of Christopher Alexander, we talk about it. He was an architect. I don't remember where was he from, but he was saying that nowadays architecture was also had a huge problem, and
Mm.
he believed has to do it was more than just the physical space. He believed that spaces also created uh, more complex emotions and experiences, and that the buildings shouldn't be only functional, but also that make can make a person to solve inner contradictions
Mm.
and problems, and that if you are inside a building that has problems that are not basically that buildings had not been designed for a human experience,
Mm.
but instead has been designed for efficiency, and then you have a lot of psychological problems. But one of the things I think that is interesting, he was asking or made an experiment in a town because these people had a problem deciding to build or not build certain thing in this
Mm.
town. And he said, if I ask these people to think about how do you feel about this building, most people might agree with this sentiment. And but if you ask for a reason about why we should build this construction in the city, probably people will disagree. But so I find it interesting that Christopher Alexander, in a way, was also connecting with the ideas of Jung of, okay, I take into account the feeling that something gives me, and this I translate it into action in the real world. Not I don't dismiss it, and I don't basically rely only in reason, and because when he said that when people are trying to make reasons about why shouldn't uh, build these places, oh, because maybe it's not good for the environment, or maybe it's not efficient, or maybe it's too much money, but maybe all these things are have a central point or are more interconnected when you think about feelings. And I think I agree with you in that sense.
Yeah, this is cool when somebody does something like that because it's already hard enough to build a building, right? And then to go the extra step and say like, okay, how do people feel about the building? Um, because the main thing is like time is always missing, right? It's like time is the one thing that is always missing to let go the extra step and the extra mile. And this is why then we talk about these people because they went the extra mile and put in the extra effort. And I think then you can also feel it. Like, yeah, you can make a really ugly building that everybody feels awful about for a very long time because buildings tends tend to stand for some time. Or you can make something beautiful and then people can draw enjoyment out of that. But it's like hard to put a monetary value on that. And this is an
Yeah.
always a problem. Like, okay, yeah, how would you rationalize this? That this building now costs 10% more, but people would be, I don't know, 100% more happier over the whole time where it's here. Um, it's in that sense always a balance, and yeah, really not easy to do.
Yeah, I think also from my perspective, besides the rationalization of the and globalization of culture, there is I think a dismissal of beauty nowadays. I think it's not talked as it used to. Like the idea of, okay, I want this only because it's beautiful. Like it doesn't have to be functional. It's just beautiful. Maybe some products are beautiful, but I think that in the past people had more conscious. Oh, I want to make this thing beautiful for myself. And I don't know if Jung maybe thought about beauty besides symbols.
Now, he very often thought about in the context of meaning that something then is meaningful. That means then connected to the collective parts that one has, through the deeper parts. Um, what you talked about making things beautiful, I had to think about many years ago. I was in Krakow, which is in Poland, and there's a castle there, and we went there. I went with my wife, and you could look at the cannons. Like you had the arsenal with all the weapons, and the cannons were really a work of art. They were not only efficient, there were also like ornaments on it and some tasks. I don't know what, maybe a Bible verse or whatever, which is really not necessary for a cannon. Like the function of a cannon is to shoot something, and that uh, as far as possible and as reliable as possible. And people still added all these things that are not functional and necessary, but made it beautiful, as you said. And I guess this is really something that you can also see in the buildings, especially here in Germany. Um, when people then erect something, it's really thinking in a functional, efficient, monetary sense, right? But then you're full of, you're surrounded by these things that are kind of soulless because nobody put their soul inside of them. And yeah, this is maybe something that we should learn again. Because interesting enough, when I look in Poland and I see the new buildings, they make really nice new buildings. They look just very nice.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's like the different approach to architecture that is maybe missing a little bit in Germany. That I would wish, like, okay, when we build something, it can also look nice. That would be cool. But this is not the zeitgeist. Maybe this will also then change 180 degrees again in a couple years or decades.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you another question about the group. You said that you have a lot of people from different countries coming to your group. Um, had anybody of the attendees discuss culture, or have you seen a different from different cultural lenses the different participation of people?
Like the Americans are very interested in culture. So I had one woman comes regularly. She has work in France, so she is regularly in France, and then she can participate. Otherwise, it's difficult because of the time zone difference. And she says, "Oh, that's so nice to talk to Europeans." Okay. We have British, we have some people from Poland, from Germany, and so on. Like, it would be hard to say, okay, we are European, but maybe for an American it looks all European. Even though that I would say there's quite a difference between British and German and French and other countries.
There is a difference.
But yeah, this cultural aspect, it is, but very often modernity. Like, okay, how is certain issues are dealt with today in a modern context. So there's not so much history. That would be cool to maybe have some people saying, "Oh, we have these very cool or weird rituals that are happening." But then this is the stuff that people mostly don't think about. Like I don't talk with other people about when I have Eastern, I put the little eggs on the plants because this is what has been done forever. And it's just, and there has to be like, oh, there has to be a Christmas tree for Christmas, which by the way is also a German tradition coming from Germany, which is a pagan tradition, which has nothing to do with the church, and the church in the past did not like it, but it's now part of Christmas, and yeah, to get little stuff like that. So when
we have trees in. I mean, that's the crazy thing. We have Christmas trees. In
oh
Ecuador.
really?
I mean, Ecuador is Catholic. It's super
But,
Catholic.
but what kind of tree?
Plastic trees.
But then you have the wonderful Nordmantanne, the
with the balls
of plastic
and everything
from China.
Yeah. That's the crazy thing.
That's global, isn't it?
That's the crazy thing. Like, I grew up Catholic and I didn't question most of these things, but the reality is we have a Christmas tree that now I know came from the tradition of Germans, and we are also talking about people from the Middle East, and because the Christianity came basically Jesus is from Middle East.
Yes, it's from the Middle
So,
East.
but this is in South America, so
Yeah.
like it's like
No, South America is really interesting. In my eyes, because it's a mixture of different cultures.
it
Like
is
you
a lot
have
of cultures.
you have the past, and then you have the conquistadors, the Spanish coming, but it's all the same people now. It's maybe if you have people deep in the jungle, they're likely
Yeah.
still the same. But I guess every other people living in cities, they have both in them. They have
Yeah.
the old stuff and then also the European stuff. So
Yeah.
it is a mixture. It can't be really separated. Like if you want to then say like, okay, all the indigenous people go on one side and all the people then immigrated they go on the other side. This would be yeah, a very hard thing to do. So it is interesting to see also that there's not so many countries. Such a huge continent, but you only have a handful of countries. That I find also interesting.
No, what I find interesting is there are not that many recent wars. Like, and I think,
It's pretty quiet, right?
I mean, there are is I mean, there was a war between Peru and Ecuador, and we used to say, oh, we don't like Peruvians
Oh,
wherever.
when was that?
The 90s, I think, or
Oh,
maybe the
really?
80s.
I'm completely oblivious to
Yeah,
South American
but it was
culture.
like who cares really? I mean, maybe because I was a kid, I didn't pay that much attention,
No.
but I wouldn't say that there is a strong feelings against a country or another. It feels like the process of colonization and the yeah, I mean, and also because we were basically colonized by a single culture,
Hmm.
and also the people forgetting the previous culture because people don't know almost anything about their culture before colonization.
Hmm.
Make that a blank slate for people not knowing the past disagreements between different tribes and cultures. And that's interesting because that's something I don't see here in Europe because you can see, okay, Germans have this strong culture, and French have these different cultures, and some French don't like Germans, some Germans don't like
Oh
French.
yeah, there was many wars for over hundreds of years
Yeah.
between the French and the Germans, and between the British and the French, and all this. Luckily, very luckily, has stopped. Like
Yeah.
there was constant war in Europe always.
But I imagine that that was the case also in Latin America. It's just the the history was uh, people don't know about the history,
Yeah.
so people don't care much about the different cultural differences. But yeah, um, yeah. But it's been fun talking to you. It's well, we cover a lot of topics, and it was super interesting. And thank you for coming to my podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to be here. And yeah, all good luck to you. It's exciting times.
Yeah, and so how people can find your podcast?
It's pretty easy. So it's the C.G Jung Helpdesk, and you can look at that basically in all the podcast apps that exist. I also have a meetup group on meetup.com, also called C.G Jung Helpdesk, and I have a very hidden YouTube channel where I uploaded one video just to see what happens, and of course nothing happened except for one guy subscribed to it. It's also C.G Jung Helpdesk, and yeah, that's how people can reach me. That's how people can participate and take part and learn more about Jung if they want to. And yeah, otherwise, no.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye.
If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with more people. This will help the community of Telar Maestro to continue growing.